for today's conference. The second session will be on archives at home and abroad, and I will be the chair. So you would have received quite a few emails from me over the past few days. So we are looking forward to hosting 3 different speakers in this session. And we are going to start with Tinashe Mushukavanhu and the work on unlocking Zimbabwe's literary archives with Dambudzo Marechera. Tinashe, are you here? I see that you are already a co-host. You are welcome then to share your screen share and share your presentation with us. Tinashe, are you able to share your screen with us?
I am trying.
Excellent, we see your face.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has joined who has made time to be part of this today. I am going to talk about the archives of Marechera, but also how I've been thinking away from them. So scholars such as Annalena Toivonen and Memory Chirere have written about the cult of Marechera. There's no denying that the figure of Marechera is as fascinating and popular for his personality and lifestyle, and sometimes even his writing. In a country like Zimbabwe, and for those who are politically conservative, Marechera is considered to be controversial, a term often used in the most ungenerous ways. Any association with him is a statement. Marechera made politicians, including Mugabe with his ruthlessness, uncomfortable. But what I really want to talk about is the importance of the figure of Marechera. I've written elsewhere that if Marechera had not existed, Zimbabwe would have invented him. In other words, every country needs a Marechera. I'm interested in the ways he galvanized a writing community, especially after his death. We owe some of our literary infrastructure to Marechera. The things he was fighting for could only manifest after he was gone. But before we go there, I have to set the scene. In her recently published memoir, they called you Dambudzo, Flora Virtual writes, I had the key to your flat. On the day you died, I collected all your papers. Some were clipped together, others were still in their envelopes. There was a rejection letter, hastily read, thrown into the cupboard with piles of typed sheets, crumpled clothes, dirty underwear. I rummaged through it all. I shoved everything chaotically into a suitcase, notebooks, letters, every bit of paper that bore traces of your writing or that of someone else. But I took 2 other things, the stone sculpture that Bernard Takavira gave you. From artist to artist, you treasured it, and your waistcoat. Your waistcoat is now a cultural artifact here in Berlin at the Dambudzo Marechera archive of Humboldt University. Marechera finally mummified. In the process of creating Marechera, Flora Witwaud sidelined his Black friends through writing reviews of their work, and most of them never forgave her. And I think this, so there is an absence of black testimony, Black witnesses in the construction of Marechera. Here is Musaimra Zimunya writing in Parade in 1999. And I quote, "Flora Witwaud has provoked me to write this testimony, personal testimony, as one who had a glimpse of the life of Charles Dambudzo Marechera since 1973, and especially in the last few years of his life. Although I'm no expert of his life, we shared some general moments together, drinking, reminiscing, discussing literature, laughing and quarreling. Sometimes it was exhilarating, and other times exasperating, a pattern which other writers like Mungoshi or Nyamfukudza or any ordinary citizen who had the good fortune or misfortune of encountering and conversing with him in the pub or in the street may confirm. Dambudzo could be both a delightful privilege and an unwelcome curse. I do not wish to be involved in a contest over Marechera's corpse. My village morality regards it as unsavory and indecent. So Flora, you can have him, or anyone else for that matter. I decided enough is enough. This German cultural tourist could take as much ivory jewelry home as much as she liked, but not my soul. After all, if I had not interfered with the destiny of German literature, by what right has she got to direct my culture and history? Tough luck, I'm not a jelly baby. For 10 years now, she has been trying in vain to rewrite Zimbabwe's literary history, and she's at a loss as to why the natives can't get it. Wait a minute. You want to say, but what had this to do with Dambudzo Marechera? Well, let's go back to 1981. Dambudzo is still in England. Black Sunlight is banned by the censorship board, and single-handedly, I successfully fight for its banning. What was my motive? Love of my literature and culture, of course. And where was Flora at this time? I have no idea whatsoever, and it would not have mattered to me. Come 1982, and Dambudzo returns home with the Channel 4 crew to film the return of the native son. The first place they touch is my house, and we have a dramatic union. Musaimra Zimunya is important in the history of Zimbabwean literature. He writes the first critical text on one of the first critical texts on Zimbabwean literature. And it was through him that I ended up going to study at the University of Kent for my PhD. And while I was there, I learned about many other Zimbabweans who had spent time in Kent in the 1970s. And I guess in a sense, I wanted to be part of a lineage of intellectuals and writers who had been thinking about Zimbabwean literature. And so my decision to go there was primarily a desire to be connected to this line, to this important lineage. So in 2020, I was approached, in December 2020, I was approached to contribute in a new series, an intellectual biography of Marechera. I wrote and submitted a proposal, which was workshopped with editors and then subsequently passed on to reviewers who all had no generous feedback. At first, I found it hard to read them or process them because they tore chords in my body. They made me angry and anxious. I ignored them for days until I mastered the courage to face them one by one. Who are these reviewers? Do reviewers always know what they are talking about? What is their vested interest in this process or in the subject? Why should they be anonymous and I'm not? When I'm requested to submit my full CV, institutional affiliation, writing samples, and basically hand over my whole life to must gatekeepers who remain anonymous. In order to prepare my response to them, I decided to be in dialogue with them. So I'm going to read to you from my unpublished article called A Conversation with Anonymous Readers, Anonymous Reviewers 1, 2, 3, 4. Reviewer 3. I would like the author of the monograph to argue what it is that is contained or not contained in the literature review that falls short in fully understanding Marechera, which constitutes the gap. Reviewer 4. If the book intends, as it claims, to look at Marechera as a major literary figure who provides a new understanding of post-independent Zimbabwe, then it is unclear what new material the book is working with. This has already been published in Vietwild's source book. It is good it will be published, but it should be made clear that this is not the first time such bibliography will be published. And my response was, what seems, there's a near universal claim that there is a single Marechera archive, and therefore to insist on its multiplicities is sacrilegious. There are many archives of Marechera that have been completely ignored, which will inform my work. I will state them, I'll evoke them, I'll dialogue with them, and in this way explore and expose the limitations of the prevailing scholarship. For instance, the reviewers emphasize the completeness of Flora Vietwild's Dambudzo Marechera, a source book on his life and work, and do not see the irony in that. The fact of the matter is that Black writers such as Charles Mungoshi, Musamura Zimunya, Stanley Nyamfukuza, Chenjerai Hove, Wilson Katio, among others, are missing and completely ignored in the readings of Marechera. And these were the peers he was writing with, reading with, drank with, and in whose houses he sometimes slept in. How do we have a source book without his writing friends and community? Because the idea is to isolate him and make him look like a freak of nature. So I'm very interested in Marechera's relationship with community. And I think that's been an important part of some of the work that I've been doing through and with Marechera. Before being forced into exile in 1973, Marechera was part of the community as a student activist and as a budding writer. He was actively involved in student politics and literary initiatives. Then he was known as Charles Marechera before his nickname Dambudzo took hold and became his writerly identity. He struggles to settle in Zimbabwe after his return from a decade in the United Kingdom. Some of the leading Black writers in the early 80s had also been in exile with him, and the early years of independence were not animated by camaraderie or a friendly rivalry of a close-knit cohort, but antipathy, insecurity, jealousy. Marechera had no permanent friends. He tried for a position in the Zimbabwe Writers' Union and lost. The only reason he lost was because people were afraid of his outsized influence and they didn't want to antagonize the political system. Marechera remembered. My contacts with other writers are on a superficial level. There's the Writers' Union. I was there when it was founded. Its constitution does not contain a single clause which guarantees freedom of expression. And at the founding meeting, I argued very strongly that such a clause be inserted, but the other writers refused. So I forced the issue to a vote. I stood for Secretary General of the Union, and I lost to Musamura Zimunya by 4 votes. When I lost, I knew it was maybe childish. I just walked out and told them that I would have nothing to do with this. Once Marechera lost, people decided to remove themselves from his ideas. And that is when the rift with the community happened. That's when he decided to start a writing agency, which was very popular. Marechera's writing agency was a professional service which he initiated to act as a publishing consultant to support young writers with editorial advice. It not only gets fabulous press in all the newspapers for the days that he runs it, but news of the venture also spread quickly by word of mouth. For those 4 days of operation, there were long queues of young writers from Harare, Mutare, Penalonga, Bulawayo, Gweru, curious young people desperate to pitch their stories to a famous local writer. And because the government paid attention to what Marechera did or who he met, they decided to close his office. They came and dragged him out of the office and threw him on the streets. There was a lot of dislocation. People who had come back into the country from the war, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And so everyone had stories and they just didn't know how to share them or where to turn for help. And the government bureaucrats were unconcerned. And Marechera decided to be the story doctor who provided an outlet for people to vent their pent-up emotions. Apparently his office, which also has a mythical quality to it, had no furniture. It was just carpeted with a phone in the corner. Everyone would come in and sit. So he was almost like a monk, a spiritual healer. He decided to build a healing platform outside the official institutions. Marechera understood the sickness that was all around him, a sickness that could only be cured through storytelling sessions. Even though the writing agency failed, it was only after his death that the Budding Writers Association of Zimbabwe was created, and other literary infrastructure for writers. So the reason I'm showing this page from Wikipedia is that Wikipedia doesn't have biographies. So Marechera has the most active literary estate or literary archive of writers of his generation, most of whom have now passed. Chenjerai Hove, Charles Mgoshi, more recently, and others a few years back. And a lot of the work I've been doing has also just been learning from the Marechera archive to try and map out other archives. And yeah, I guess to navigate Zimbabwean literature through Marechera. And it is for that reason that I started reading Zimbabwe.com, which was essentially a website trying to document books about Zimbabwe published since the 1950s. So instead of reading Marechera in isolation, I wanted to read Marechera in the context of his generation, in the context of the publishing history of Zimbabwe. So the website was pretty much built out of curiosity. It has 40 categories, which were pretty much points of curiosity. So questions I have about different aspects of Zimbabwean life. The author index became important because the microbiographies I was generating sometimes are the only sort of biographies you can find of, especially Zimbabwean writers who write in Shona and Ndebele. The internet, even though it promises a ubiquity of information or easy access, I found it to be deleterious of languages like Shona and Ndebele that are not serviced by the internet. So most of the books in Shona and Ndebele are not on the internet. So the metadata, book covers, basic information like year of publication, synopsis are all missing. And so this is one of my favorite parts because I've had to search for these people. So this is what...
Sorry, Tinashe, just want to remind you of the time. Can you please almost wrap up? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I'll close by talking about this exhibition I did called Beautiful Words Are Subversive. So the iconography was from Marechera. I wanted to use photographs of Marechera for an exhibition, but it was difficult to use them. And so, yeah, part of how I've been working with the Marechera archive was also been creating a new archive out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Sorry to cut you short. Please, can we have questions from our attendees so that we can, Dr. Mushakavanhu can discuss this with us a bit more. Thank you. While the participants are typing out their questions, I would like to ask a question. You mentioned that you are specifically interested in Marechera's relationship with communities. Was there something, some relationship that stood out for you in the archival research that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many relationships that stand out in Marechera's life, and most of them are documented in video, they're documented in audio, so people spend time with him. So before the Flora Virtual project, there were other people that had spent time with Marechera. And so, yeah, so there are other sort of archivists or people that had interest in Marechera, and that's how I've been learning about Marechera. And other people don't want to be identified because the relationships are difficult between the different people that are still alive, and so I've had to learn to respect that.
Thank you so much. We also have a question from the chat. After your engagement with the anonymous reviewers, what is the final verdict? Will you write the book?
I will write the book, but I'll write it on my own terms. I think that I will write the book. The dialogue that I kind of referenced at the very beginning is going to be part of the book. So it's going to be a book of with multiple kind of a book with multiple perspectives. Yes.
Thank you so much. Then we have another question. This is valuable sets of materials, possible the only of its kind. Have you made any connections with Zimbabwe-based universities to expand on the reach of this set of materials? Are other people actively using the archive and are writing about him, or is this still too sensitive?
I mean, the University of Zimbabwe is supposed to have some material on Marechera, which I've not been able to look at. The National Archives of Zimbabwe has some stuff, but it seems like the
Tinashe, are you still there? We seem to have lost you. I think that there's currently some technical difficulties on Dr. Mushakavanhu's side. Can you please just be patient with us and please let us know more in the chat. Ask more questions there until he connects again. Thank you. Okay, in the meantime, while we wait for Dr. Mushukavanhu to join us again, we can actually, here he is. Thank you, Tinashe. Can you just repeat your answer for the question there? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I was saying that there is supposed to be an archive of Marechera at the University of Zimbabwe, but I've not been able to access it. And there is some material at the National Archives of Zimbabwe. Those are the only two institutions in the country that is some kind of material, but the rest of it is outside the country. So you have to go to Berlin, you have to go to Reading, you have to go to other places to engage with Marechera. So unless if you have funding, it is an impossible task. And so part of my attitude has been what Sadia Hatmin talks about, critical fabulation. So if I can't access it, I'll make it. So in some of the work I've been doing, I make my own archive of Marechera, and in that way open it up more. And I use the small references I have access to, whether it's a list of what is contained in an archive, and then I make up the stuff, and that generate discussion.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. So we have here a journalism master student looking at Marechera's influence on literary journalists, especially those now operating in South Africa. What, if anything, do you make of influence on writers like Bongani Kona, Percy Izimvuya, and yourself in publications like Shipwreck? It's also in the chat if you would just like to refer back to it.
I mean, I guess we're all inspired by Marechera differently. I think if we are connected to him in any way, it's maybe a more intellectual, on the basis of intellectual curiosity, on the basis of intertextuality, on the basis of a love and interest in generating a cultural discourse.
Okay. Thank you so much for these very thoughtful questions. I know that there are some that haven't been answered yet. I suggest that you can either direct message Dr. Mushukavanhu that he can answer them. It's also here in the chat so that you can refer back to it, or you can also email him to continue this discussion. Thank you so much for the very interesting and insightful presentation that you did. I would really appreciate it. Okay, so then we're actually going to move on to our next or our second speaker. So we have Dr. Siphiwo Mahala on his archival work on Can Themba, who recently published a biography on Can Themba. So we look forward to your presentation. You should be able to screen share. Please do so. Thank you, Dr. Mahala.
Hi. Okay, I was trying to share before I could unmute myself, which proved problematic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay. Thank you, Anik. Well, interestingly, as I was listening to Professor Kosikaba, she in some way paid tribute to Michael Titlestadt, and my relationship with Can Themba began exactly 20 years ago when I was a creative writing student of Professor Michael Titlestadt, when I wrote The Suit Continued, which is a reimagination of Can Themba's most famous story, The Suit. So from that point, I wanted to know more. Actually, I felt somewhat obliged to know more about Can Themba. So with this presentation, I'm gonna try and reflect on what I call the excavation of the archive in remembering Can Themba. Just a brief introduction. Can Themba was a South African writer and journalist born in Marabastad, Pretoria in 1924, and he died while exiled in Swaziland in 1967. That time, my parents had not even met. And he's described by Yeshua Benet as perhaps the most talented of the writers of the late 50s and early 60s. So I see Can Themba as a journalist working for Drum and Golden City Posts, having played a vital role in the development of print culture in South Africa. So as mentioned in the introduction, I've recently published the very first biography of Can Themba. Here's a copy published by Wits University Press, which is published exactly 55 years after his passing. So when Can Themba died, he did not have a single book to his name, and he was banned under the Suppression of Communism Amendment Act in 1965. Well, what this means basically is that he could neither be published nor quoted in South Africa. He remained a banned citizen until 1982. That's 15 years after his death. So legislatively, there was a deliberate and concerted effort to erase his memory. So Can Themba's archives encapsulating his life and works was quite fragmented. The most documented of his period is when he worked for Drum magazine, that is between 1953 and 1959. And not much is known after that period. So he died in Swaziland, and his lonely death in exile also meant some of his writings were lost. His family claims that he used to keep his manuscripts in a particular box that unfortunately disappeared when he passed. So, but the collection of his works began shortly after his passing, and new material continues to be discovered, including unpublished writings and those that he published using pseudonyms. So in doing this research on Can Themba, I had to essentially follow a hybrid model that includes, his published works or works published about him, the oral narratives, where I did over 20 interviews, as well as private and institutional archives. So in terms of published material, what I would consider as primary texts in researching about Can Themba include obviously his own works, The Will to Die, published in 1972, The World of Can Themba, published in 1985, as well as Requiem for Sophia Town, which was published in 2006. And well, there are some sources where Can Themba, appears quite prominently in terms of published books. These include A Good Looking Corpse by Michael Nichol, Drum by Anthony Sampson, one of the editors of, actually the first editor that Can Themba worked with, and Who Killed Mr. Drum by Sylvester Stein, another editor who had a very close relationship with Can Themba, and In a Fiery Continent by Tom Hopkinson, the editor who fired Can Themba from Drum magazine. But also what has been helpful are the oral narratives. As I said, I was fortunate to conduct over 20 interviews, and each of the interviews really gave insight on an aspect of Can Themba. For instance, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who's still alive, was with Can Themba at the University of Fort Hare and had great things to say and shared really formidable insights about their period at the time. You'd remember Can Themba was at Fort Hare with the likes of Robert Mugabe, Robert Sobukwe, Nzumu Khehle, and many other prominent individuals. And there were some colleagues like Jürgen Skadeberg, Peter Makubane, Jumayet, Joe Tholwe. And as you would notice, some of these people have since passed. And well, I was fortunate to speak to his wife, his widow, Can Themba, who also has since passed, who really gave insights about Can Themba now as a family man, as a boyfriend and all, as a father. And then there are, those like Sora Shilo, Abdul Bam, and Mushengondo, who spoke about Can Themba as a teacher, and others as a mentor. Think of Professor Mbulelo Mzamane, Pitika Nduli, and now the late Lindiwe Mabuza. And then other insights were from social point of view: Pax Mangena, Nadine Godima, Don Matera, Ahmed Kathrada, Malcolm Hart, and others. And of course, as a literary icon, where I spoke to the likes of Njabulo Ndebele, Motobi Mutwazi, and Lucas Ledwaba. More than half of the people that I interviewed for this research have since passed away. And so I was very conscious as I was talking to them of building an archive. All these interviews were video recorded. Okay, I'm trying to, sorry. And then, some of these archives, for instance, show Can Themba as a student at Fort Hare. This is one of his earliest photographs available. It is dated 1948. And then obviously this was the first photograph of Can Themba appearing in Drum magazine when he won the first short story competition in 1953. It was taken in December 1952 by Jürgen Skadeberg. With each photograph, there is always a story that explains, that puts it in context. And of course, until now, Can Themba was barely, described as a family man, or there was barely ever a family perspective in the reporting of Can Themba's life. In fact, one of his colleagues, Obed Musi, is on record in A Good Looking Corpse saying, "I've never heard of anyone saying I'm Can Themba's relative." So I was fortunate to speak to the family and managed to access this archival material, which is a private family archive, which they shared with me. So you see Can Themba here with his daughter and wife. And again, I interviewed Pax Mangena when I went down to Swaziland. Pax Mangena had known Can Themba when they were had known Can Themba in Sofia town, and then they met again in Babane. So you have them here in what they called the Can Themba corner, which resembles the kind of shebeens that Can Themba frequented in South Africa. So you see him, engaging in a similar kind of activity in Swaziland. And Swaziland chapter is one of the aspects that were barely recorded about Can Themba. And then apart from what I refer to as private archives, there are also these institutional collections. In this regard, I worked with the University of Fort Hare, which gave me access to his student records. I accessed, some of the material from the drum material, mainly from the Belly archives, as well as Amazwi, South African Museum of Literature, which was very helpful in as far as written content is concerned, beyond the drum, especially.
Apologies, Siphiwo, we still can't see your presentation. Can you maybe just make sure that you are sharing that with us?
Oh, okay. Oh my goodness! At one stage, did you not see?
Yes, we are listening though. Very close. Thank you.
Okay. Oh. Can you see now?
Yes, we can. Thank you so
much. Can you see the Investor of Fort Hare thing?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry about that. So I'll just run through all of this. This was Can Themba's first photograph on drum. It was one of the most famous photographs. And here you see Can Themba with his wife Anne and their daughter Murungwa. And then here you see Can Themba with Pax Mangena in Swaziland, Mbabane. This they called the Can Themba Corner. It was at the Central Hotel. And then now I was talking about the archive student records at Fort Hare. So here we see Can Themba's application letter at the University of Fort Hare in 1944. He was a student at Khaiso Secondary School in Seshego, Limpopo province. And here we have Can Themba's application form dated 22 December 1944. There's been contestation about the most banal things like Can Themba's name, his tribe, and all such things. One of the claims, for instance, is that Can Themba's surname was Thembe, and that he changed it when he got to Sofia town. Reason being, he didn't want to be identified. He didn't want to be recognized as being of Shangaan origins. But here we see that in high school already, he was Themba. When he was asked which tribe, all of this is in the form that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. He said Zulu. His home language, interestingly, is Afrikaans, and denomination was identified as Anglican. And also, this is a letter of Can Themba where he was trying to get his certificate for the UED, the University Education Diploma. And again, Can Themba spent 2 years trying to get his certificate. And even though he was working for drum, he kept pursuing this. And this partly shows his commitment to teaching, something that becomes very clear in his career later on. And okay, I think I sort of confused the correspondence, but here you see his confirmation of the Mendy Scholarship. Throughout his education at Fort Hare, he was funded by the Mendy Memorial Scholarship, and he was the first winner thereof. And also at Fort Hare, I managed to obtain one of his earliest published writing, This was when he was doing his first year at Fort Hare, dated 1945, a poem called Thirst in the Hearts of Men. And again, while he's most well known for winning the jump shot competition in 1943, Can Themba, first won the Zong poetry competition in 1949, as you can see. And also, going through the state archives, one of the major discoveries was that he was trying to go to Kenya in 1954 to cover the uprisings in that country. And obviously that was turned down. And in conclusion, the retrieval of archive material, including poems, short stories, articles, and all other official material, give a unique perspective in his development as a writer, a creative intellectual, and also his struggles in terms of his career, both as a teacher and as a journalist. So the collection of his archives has been vital in remembering Can Themba. In other words, putting together different fragments of his life into a composite whole, because one of the major challenges has been that, his memory, his archive has been fragmented and, in some respects, misrepresented. That is why it was exciting to actually access this material. And finally, we have his very first biography. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahala. That was fantastic. And a big congratulations again on your publication of your biography of Can Themba. That is fantastic. And you can see, our participants can see on the screen here that we have a discount code from Bridge Books where you can purchase Dr. Mahala's book, and please do support this initiative. So I'm opening the floor to any questions. Please feel free to make use of the chat, or you can also activate your mic and ask your question. Thank you. Prof. Bates, please go ahead with your question.
Thanks so much. Siphiwo, that was fantastic. It's really interesting to hear about all the different records that you had to access. And I was wondering, you talk a lot about the interviews you did and the oral histories. And if you could just say something about how that supplemented what you find in the written record, because it can sometimes be so difficult to find records. I'm experiencing this myself with some of my research, and yet you're not always sure with the oral histories whether there's bias or whether people are misremembering or they're trying to paint themselves in a certain light, for example. So if you could just talk a bit about some of the tensions between the oral and the written sources, it would be really interesting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I mean, the combination of the two really helped. One of the instances I can recall of contradiction between oral and written history. Jean Hart, who had a relationship with Can Themba, and as a married woman, British woman, she came to the country in 1957, and in her welcome party hosted by her husband, she met Can Themba and fell in love with him. And so she later spoke about her experience in South Africa and linking it with the Sharpeville massacre. And Sharpeville massacre happened in 1960. And there were certain factors that did not make sense to me, that did not add up, until I met with Malcolm Hart, her husband, who then gave me some of the information and could recall more accurately that it was actually 1957 and not 1960. And that justified many other things that I found confusing. As a sidebar, Malcolm Hart had a child with Themba Jabavu, known as a daughter, and their son is called Tengo Jabavu. Sorry, is called Tengo Hart. So that's a sidebar in relation to the earlier presentation. But the other is when I was, interviewing Nadine Godima, she was quite elderly, and in the course of the conversation, I could tell that now she's no longer talking about Can Themba. She was talking about Net Nagasa. But fortunately, I had studied, I had done some research on Nagasa as well, so I could distinguish between the two. And yeah, there were many other factors that I found interesting in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We also have a question here. What was his political views? What led him to being banned?
Well, first of all, Can Themba was non-partisan. There were claims that he worked for the ANC underground. And, when I finally met with Ahmed Kathrada, whom I was told to share some of the information. And Kathrada was very clear to me that Can Themba, in all his interactions with him, he had nothing to do with the ANC as a member. However, he was a journalist who was politically conscious. In the 50s, quite ironically, he wrote a column explaining why he's not a communist. And interestingly, years later, he would be banned under the Suppression of Communism Act. But he was, very sharp as a political commentator. After 1960, after the Shipwreck massacre in 1960, he was often called, journalists from all over the world came to South Africa to seeking opinions from what we would call today political analysts. And he was often interviewed along those lines. And you would remember that at Fort Hare, he went there with the likes of Sobukwe, Dennis Brutus, Mugabe, and Zumukeshe and others. You could see already that while he was politically conscious, he was very clear about his path. For instance, he used to publish in student journals like Fortarian and Senk, which were literary journals in the main. He and Dennis Brutus published short stories and poetry. And someone like Robert Sobukwe used to publish consistently in Beware, which was a political pamphlet. And the articles that were published there were political. So Can Themba, I think he was very clear from a very young age that he did not want to be a politician. He was not a card-carrying member of any political party. However, he remained political conscious. He was one of the first, for instance, to write an article warning the ANC about the rise of Africanists within the ANC. And later on, we would see that the Africanists broke away to form the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC. And he was also close friends with the likes of Dumanokwe, who would later become the Secretary General of the ANC. I'll hold it there, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Then you have lots of compliments from participants saying that they're really enjoying your biography and that it is a remarkable accomplishment. And then we also have a question here. When writing and creating the biography, did you receive conflicting information or stories? And if so, how did you choose to handle it?
Yeah, well, part of it is what I referred to earlier. But also I had to, demystify some of the perceptions, doing this research. For instance, one of the authorities in as far as the drum period is concerned, I referred to earlier, is Obed Musi, who worked with Can Themba and says Can Themba was, he had never heard of anyone saying I'm Can Themba's family. Yet I was able to speak to his wife, I interact with his children. And also he goes on to say, Can Themba was of Shangaan origins. He used to be Thembe and he changed his surname when he got to Sophia Town. Yet when I trace his student records, as far back as the 40s, as far back as his high school period, Can Themba was Themba, and and there were many others, that I had to discover along those lines.
Thank you so much. And then we have one final question. Who are other Themba's contemporaries that you discovered during your research that you felt that their stories are not well documented?
Well, not necessarily people who are undocumented. Many of them are documented, but it is the connections that we couldn't make in some areas that, especially when you look at Fort Hare, what would become of the guys that went to Fort Hare at the same time with Can Themba. For instance, Dennis Brutus, it is very clear that they studied they went through the same kind of education, and you see what will become of them later on. And the likes of Nzumu Khehle, who became Prime Minister of Lesotho, Robert Mugabe, whose story is very well known, Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, and many others. So it is the connections, the connections that would make, for instance, that one of the things that come out strongly in the book is Can Themba as a teacher, that Can Themba taught someone like Casey Mutsisi in high school. And then when he became the editor of Africa magazine, which is not very well known, he called some of his former students, like Casey himself, who was studying at the Normal College in Pretoria, to come and become his assistant. So Casey became an icon in his own right as a journalist. I mean, there were many others of his students, the likes of now the late Bishop Desmond Mbilodudu, who passed away earlier this year, was his student in high school. And there are many other such instances where you sort of draw parallels to say, this person ended up here partly because he was Can Themba's student, or he was touched by by Can Themba in a particular way. All of that is in the book. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation, and we look forward to reading your biography. Well done again. So then we are going to move on to our next speaker, Professor Michael Titlestadt. He will be talking about his book that he recently published as well, about archival research required to write his book titled Shipwreck Narratives Out of Our Depth. Welcome, Professor Titlestadt, and we look forward to listening to your presentation. You should be able to share your screen as well. Please do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's no need to share my screen, unfortunately, because I have no slides. I'm just going to chat.
Perfect, thank you.
So there are no technical problems, at least. Just to say thank you to everyone for being here, and particularly to Beth, Letitia, and Annika for their remarkable organization of this conference and their very diligent communication with all of us. I'm going to speak a little bit about the book. Following Siphiwo's example, I'm just going to hold it up to show you that it has material existence. The book is called Shipwreck Narratives Out of Our Depth. And Annika, you're going to have to watch the time very carefully, because if you get me talking about shipwreck narratives, there's no shutting me up. But
I will definitely let you know.
I'll try and stick to the 20 minutes. But let me tell you how the book is structured. The first half of the book is a detailed study of 6 historical shipwreck narratives in context. And then the second half of the book is 12 essays which concern the ways in which historical shipwreck narratives were taken up by novelists or poets, filmmakers, and by a visual artist. But I think in order to grasp the kind of nature of the research, the sort of obsession that I've had for decades now concerning shipwreck narratives, I just need to sort of give you some historical contextualization of the shipwreck narrative and its place in print culture. Now, the shipwreck narratives were essentially coterminous with the expansion of the seaborne empires, initially with the Portuguese seaborne empire. And they were initially known as string literature in Portugal in the 16th century. And they were called string literature because they were hung on strings in print shop windows. And apparently there were sort of long queues awaiting the next publication of a shipwreck narrative. And they were taken up in a variety of different print forms, even in Portugal in the 16th century. I'll come back to those sort of various forms of shipwreck narratives in a moment. But they may, and there's a strong argument that can be made in this regard, they may constitute, in fact, one of the first popular literary forms in Europe. Popular in the sense that they were very widely distributed, they were printed in affordable editions, and they were also very frequently adapted and expurgated by other writers. And so had these sort of manifold channels of circulation in the societies. The Portuguese narratives would be taken up and exert a very strong influence on narratives that accompanied the expansion of the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. Those that I focused on were particularly those connected to East India Company ships that were part of the English East India Company expansion. The interesting thing about these narratives is that they tended to appear initially in quite respectable book form. And they tended to be sold very generally, distributed very widely, but very quickly they were adapted as pamphlets or as broadsheets, or they were adapted into various polemics by people associated with religious and other sort of ideological concerns. So they proved highly versatile forms. Obviously, the shipwreck narrative has an ancient provenance, both in classical literature and then obviously a biblical provenance. And those ideas were taken up in a way which is quite fascinating in terms of the normal hubris and arrogance that we associate with imperial expansionism, because the shipwreck narrative, in many ways, is a subversion of the logic of empire. So while you get official documents that announce the cartographical and political and economic ambitions of imperialism and the kind of triumphalist versions of imperialism that circulate in popular literature, the shipwreck narrative is interestingly subversive, because what it shows is the fragility of imperial expansion. So you've got the sense that, in fact, the ship, which is a microcosm or a chronotope of empire, is destroyed on some foreign or strange shore, and people suddenly find themselves outside of their context, outside of the duplication of that context on board ship. and are suddenly, in fact, in a kind of inverted imperial circumstance, where often European sailors, writers, passengers, find themselves, in fact, vulnerable and more or less dependent on indigenous inhabitants for hospitality and care. And so the narratives have this subversive quality of essentially reversing colonial relations. They do so, I must sort of add, I think it's quite important, that those inversions are temporary. They kind of evanescent exceptions to the logic of empire, in the sense that the military and economic establishment is always waiting in the wings to reassert itself. And order, in terms of an imperial order, is inevitably restored. But there is a very strong sense in which the shipwreck narratives test empire and test the logic of empire. And obviously what they do is they demonstrate both the writing to pieces, to use Josiah Blackmore's notion in a wonderful book on Portuguese shipwreck narrative called Manifest Perdition. The narratives actually write the ship to pieces in discourse. And in doing so, what they do is they collapse the hierarchical microcosm of shipboard life. And one has this sort of interesting sense then of voices emerging in shipwreck narratives which are not authorized. They're not necessarily the dominant actors in the imperial project, because shipwreck narratives tended to be authored or dictated by common sailors, by junior officers, by passengers. So one has a sort of proliferation of this storytelling practice across empire in its various iterations as it unfolds globally. Just say some of the implications for print culture are fascinating. I made the claim earlier on that shipwreck narratives can be counted among the earliest forms of a popular literature. But the interesting thing is that my archival research into those historical narratives, I was able in each case to recover the original publications and then to see contemporary reviews and comments on those publications. But what was most fascinating was really this incredible proliferation of forms in a popular literary mode, that it was in fact the anthologization and the expurgation and the rewriting of those very important historical narratives, which proved to be absolutely fascinating, which changes the nature of the archival search. And I want to just, in the course of this brief chat, just mention three anecdotes. And the first anecdote pertains to my excavation of the original publication of Alexander Dalrymple's account of the wreck of the Grosvenor on the southeast coast of South Africa. It was on the India Passage. Obviously, it was an East India Company ship, and it wrecked in 1791. And the first detailed account of the wreck was in fact written by the company hydrographer Alexander Dalrymple, who's a very important presence across colonial historiography in one form or another. But the interesting thing is, when I called up that publication when I was at the Cape Town repository of the National Archives, it came bound completely coincidentally with another account of the wreck of the Grosvenor. And that account was the most sensationalist version of the wreck that you can imagine, and in fact shows no knowledge of the event itself other than a broadest sense what had been published in the press at the time. And it's the most graphic sort of tabloid version that you can imagine. And it's essentially an improvisation on a number of highly racist, colonial, and in fact, stories, but also the kind of series of stories from antiquity regarding Africa. So it includes these perverse anecdotes, such as the supposedly the Amampondo people who the survivors encounter, that they have a practice of urinating on the bride at weddings, and that they in order not to conceive twins, men remove one testicle. All these absolutely perverse anecdotes that had obviously lodged in the sensationalist, Orientalist mindset of Europe at the time. So it was that sort of combination of Dalrymple's very diligent and careful account of the wreck, which was written originally for the company, but interestingly, although it was an official report, it became, in terms of the time at which it was published, it became a best-selling publication. But it was that binding together in my very early stages of research about 15 years ago, which sort of drew my attention to this diversity of print culture and circulation, and the way in which these stories, while they might appear and be circulated predominantly in something like a respectable and verifiable form, become in fact an inspiration for multiple texts, and actually recovering and reading those texts. Firstly, obviously, there's a problem of the kind of fragility of that literature, because while records and archives tend to collect authorized texts, the more popular texts published as pamphlets and broadsides are represented now by only occasional examples. I was very privileged to work in the Archives of the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and they do have some of those documents. But obviously, because they are ephemera, they tend to have disappeared from the archive, although they are absolutely integral to the story of the circulation of shipwreck literature. Just to bring me to my second anecdote, the interesting thing about shipwreck narratives in the archive is also that because of their history of publication, because they tended to be collected by an amanuensis who would transcribe an account often from an illiterate sailor, or also because they tended to be subjected to multiple revisions and often sort of were slowly tailored from oral testimony into a publishable form. There are often a number of precedent documents in archives through which you can trace the emergence of the final published version. These are not common, but in a couple of cases, I was able to sort of trace the emergence of the final sort of verified and remembered shipwreck narrative, or the still extant shipwreck narrative. And it's that kind of lineage which just brings me to my second anecdote, which is the shipwreck of the Winterton on Mauritius, which is an absolutely intriguing tale. And if anyone would like a copy of the, well, you can discover it on the internet quite easily, but if anyone would like PDF versions of any of these narratives, I'm happy to send them to you. But the Winterton story, like many shipwrecks, gathered a number of narratives. So again, there is no single narrative, but a multiplicity of voices. That multivocality is fascinating in relation to shipwreck narrative, precisely because one does have various speaking positions with representatives from a number of different constituencies. But this moment of delight for me, and I'm not a historian by training, I've kind of just sort of muddled through archival research as a literature scholar. I'm very interested in historical contextualization, but as a consequence, archival research always has a kind of magic to me, and I have this sort of sense of awe of the original when I read an original publication or even a handwritten manuscript. And one of my sort of glowing moments in that regard was in my research into the Winterton narratives. There are a number of them. One of them is written by a man called John Dale, and there I was able to discover the very first version that was handwritten. And in a sense, the alarming thing perhaps is when I was in the archive, there was no knowledge of its existence. It was simply sort of gathered under the Winterton narratives and signaled only by the name of the ship. So I called up all of the various Winterton narratives at the archive. And it's a small tangential archive. And I was presented as part of the bundle of documents at the desk. I was presented with the original handwritten John Dale version, as well as, and this was fascinating for me, his annotations on the published version. And it was a sort of glorious sense, having been immersed in his narrative in that particular text, to not only see his handwriting, but also then to see his amendments and additions. And one of the things that have fascinated me about the Winterton story is that a character person called Isabella Cullen is at the center of most of the narratives. She becomes the sort of doyenne, the sort of woman who keeps up morale and shows a great deal of dedication and mediates between the survivors and the local chieftain whose clan they are in fact shown a great deal of hospitality by. But there's a moment in all of the narratives about the drowning of her daughter when the ship first fragments and has been washed up on the coral reef. And what was intriguing to me was that the identity of that daughter was unknown, that her name was unknown. She was always described, but only described in the loosest terms, as really the cause of Isabella Cullen's mourning and the kind of initial abject state in which she found herself before she kind of rallied her resources and came to the assistance of the other survivors. And there was a sort of haunting absence of just about the name of the daughter, who was described and whose death was described in detail, and whose the consequences of whose death were central to all of the narratives. And then there was just this moment of looking through John Dale's annotations of the original published manuscript, and was able to correlate the handwriting with his own handwritten account, was the sudden recognition of her name, and that her name was Anne. And it might sound the most banal discovery at one level, but there was this incredible sense of suddenly a person taking on not just only a tangential described identity, but at some level her own presence. And it was a sort of moment that I explored in the essay that I published in the book. My final anecdote, and then I will stop, I know I've got 3 minutes left. My final anecdote relates to the second part of the book. I spoke about the way in which these historical narratives were taken up by writers, filmmakers, and artists. And I was particularly interested in open boat narratives and their history. So I traced the historical provenance, and then I discovered and became very interested in the film Lifeboat, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, an early Hitchcock film. And I discovered that it was based on a novella, in inverted commas, by John Steinbeck. So I headed off, thanks to research funding, there is a Steinbeck archive, and it's called the Heasley Cox Center. And what I did was I was able to read Steinbeck's original novella, which was never published, but was used as the basis of the film, which was reworked into screenplay form. And reading it was this absolutely intriguing process of seeing the way in which a very politically engaged, essentially left-wing representation of sailors and competence and power had been sort of slowly ameliorated by the time the film was made, which more or less is a kind of racist, in many senses, a kind of pejorative version of the working class and labor. So it was wonderful to be able to trace that trajectory, but then I will stop in a minute. But my real sort of glorious experience, and this is not about print culture, but about the delight of the material, was I went to the Steinbeck Center in Salinas, which is the big sort of museum to Steinbeck. And in the archive, I was sitting with the archivist, and she pulled out a box and allowed me to hold 2 of Steinbeck's smoking pipes. As a pipe smoker, this is a deeply spiritual experience. And there was a sort of, again, this sort of sense of the archive as a material presence, which I get from both texts and from objects of that order. All right, I've run out of time, but just to say that this this research and writing that I've done in relation to shipwreck narratives, I'm really happy to share with anyone who's interested. But it's proved the most fascinating obsession, and it's perfect kind of research for dinner table conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Titlestadt. That was so interesting and fascinating, and thank you very much for your passion for the subject matter as well. And please do share those PDF narratives with me as well. And I trust with our participants as well. That was very interesting. And then I also just want to again say congratulations on your publication of your book, as you can see here on the screen. And we also have a discount code for this at Bridge Books. So please make use of this opportunity if you are interested in reading more on shipwreck narratives in this amazing undertaking. So I'm going to open up the floor for any questions. Please make sure to use the chats, or you can activate your mic, and we can start this section of the session 2. Thank you. So while we are waiting for people to type out their questions, I actually have something that I would like to ask specifically on your process of how you went about doing your research. So you talked about recovering the original material and contemporary reviews and the proliferation of forms. How do you actually undertake something at this scale? Can you please share a bit about your methodology or approach? Thanks.
My approach, I'm embarrassed to admit, is to throw myself onto the mercy of archivists primarily. Archivists and librarians are my favorite, apart from jazz musicians, perhaps my favorite human beings on the entire planet. And I just must say that my research has been guided so helpfully by various archivists. Also, we formed a society called Society for the Study of Shipwreck. We wanted largely because it had SOS in the acronym, and it was formed in a pub in London, and it has no remit, no funding, and no formal membership. But what we do is we share ideas and resources among those people who are obsessed with shipwreck narrative. And I suppose it's once you've got a sort of community of obsession, people draw one another's attention to documents and to archives. So I've been very lucky to be on the receiving end of assistance from that network. Also, in terms of just sort of print culture and archives, the difficulties are, of course, that because so many different forms are published, that one has to, and also that these are global texts that are disseminated to other metropolitan but also post-colonial contexts, one's forced to just journey from one archive to another, and from one library to another, which is one of the reasons why it's a project that, although I published along the way, it's a publish that took a process that took a long time in gestation. When I mentioned the Society for the Study of Shipwreck, I was more or less, it was a drunken imaginative invention, and it's an informal network. But anyone who's interested in this research or in access to archives or working on shipwreck narrative, I'm happy to put you in touch with the relevant people.
Excellent. I already see that somebody asked for the contact details for the society, so please do share that. And we have another question asking about what period did your research cover?
Yeah, I was a bit cavalier about periodicity. The historical narratives are all from the 18th and 19th century. And it was necessary for me to try and link those 6 longer investigations that are the first half of the book. But the second half of the book that looks at representations, particularly literary representations of shipwreck, and the way in which they use the historical archive. That looks at shipwreck recycling essentially from sort of intertextuality, from the recycling of the Grosvenor story, particularly in various colonial texts, and then also in apartheid writing. But I also look at literary representations of wrecks that everyone knows about, such as the Titanic, and including musical composition, which is kind of musical engagements with the sinking of the Titanic. So the second half of the book is very diverse, and in fact cuts across history from the really from the 18th century, more or less, to the present. It concludes with reflections on contemporary autobiographical and memoir writing about shipwrecks in the Mediterranean and migrancy. So it tells a story with a sort of ancient provenance, but tries to bring the story into the present, to focus on kind of the current shipwrecks that are relevant and haunting.
Thank you so much. We also have then a few comments. Prof. LaRue just mentions the description of the material nature of the archives. It resonates so much. It's one of the loveliest aspects of our archival research. And then Dr. Remington just also mentions that she would love to talk to you more and that she's drawn on your work in her own work on sea narratives. So her piece on Soul Blakey's 1914 sea voyage. So, and just confirming an equal admiration of archivists. And so that's perfect. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, we have just one got in. Prof. Patton just asked, have you researched the Waratah's disappearance?
And the Waratah is a fascinating example of mystery as a series of narratives. And I've read what research has emerged about the Waratah's disappearance, and it's a fascinating enigma at so many levels. And I've read the most recent studies of the Waratah's disappearance. David, I don't know if you're interested, you're probably familiar with it, but there's a very strange popular novel which I grew up with, and I think was almost on, alongside the Reader's Digest compendiums, was on everyone's bookcase, is a novel called Send of the Sea by Geoffrey Jenkins. And it's the most intriguing, bizarre, popular rendition of the disappearance of the Waratah. So I have looked at that research. I haven't written it all on the Waratah. There's a great deal more to be said about it, but it's obviously something which, because it's so enigmatic, is not heavily narrativized, and therefore sort of fell outside of the purview of my research.
Okay, any other questions? One final question. Thank you so much, Professor Titlestadt. That was very interesting, and you can definitely see your passion for the subject matter. And please do share your experience and your wealth of knowledge with the rest of us. We definitely would like to get more access to these narratives. And then once again, congratulations on your publication of your book. And please just be reminded as participants that there is a special discount available at Bridge Books. So please make use of that opportunity. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, to all of our speakers for the second panel. It was a fascinating talk, and please remember to reach out to the individual speakers if you have any more questions that weren't answered during our discussions or Q&A sessions. Now, we are going to enter into our lunch break, which will take place from 1 until 2. And then we will start with session 3 at 2 o'clock, which will also be chaired by Letitia Castles. So we look forward to seeing you then. Enjoy your lunch break. Thank you.